There is a particular kind of cold that settles into eastern Iowa in February, and does not ask permission, and does not negotiate, and does not leave until it is ready. Not the dramatic cold of mountain country which arrives with wind and spectacle and the sense of nature making a statement. Iowa cold in February is quieter than that. It presses itself into the ground and into the walls of buildings and into the bare branches of the oaks along the fence lines and into the joints and knuckles of men who have worked outside for 40 years, and it stays there patient and absolute until March decides otherwise. On the morning of February 8, 2001, that cold had been settled into Harlan County for 4 consecutive days without variance. The thermometer outside the kitchen window at Maddox Machine and Salvage on County Road B47 read 15 below zero at 5:30 in the morning, which was when Earl Maddox woke as he had woken at 5:30 every morning for as long as he could remember, because the body of a man who has kept a schedule for 50 years does not require an alarm clock and does not respond well to the suggestion that it should. He dressed in the dark: canvas work pants, flannel shirt, wool socks. He went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table with the cup in both hands and looked out the window at the frost on the gravel and the dark shape of the shop beyond it and the darker shape of the salvage yard beyond that. Ruth was still asleep. The house was quiet in the particular way that houses are quiet at 5:30, on mornings when the temperature is 15 below, a thick insulated quiet, as though the cold itself is pressing against the walls and the walls are holding. Earl sat with his coffee and did not read and did not turn on the radio and did not think about anything specific, which was how he spent the first half hour of most mornings. Not rest exactly. A kind of calibration, the day presenting itself in its early form before it acquired the specific shape that the hours would give it. The phone rang at 6:47. He was at the counter before the second ring, the way he was always at the counter before the second ring when calls came in the early morning, because early morning calls carried a specific gravity that his body recognized before his mind had fully processed the sound. Calvin Stroop's voice came through the line with the particular quality of a man who has been awake since before 5 and has spent the intervening hours holding himself together by the discipline of having no alternative. Calvin farmed 600 acres of corn and soybeans north of the town of Ionia, and had been an Earl Maddox customer for 20 of his 30 years of farming. He was not a man who panicked. Earl had known him long enough to understand that. But there was something in the voice that morning that Earl recognized immediately, the controlled steadiness of a man keeping himself steady by will alone, because there was no other option. Calvin said he had a problem. He said he had an Oliver 88 that he used for his grain auger in winter, running the PTO to move grain from the bins to the truck. He said the rear hub had cracked overnight, probably from the cold, and he had a grain buyer coming Monday morning to take delivery of 12,000 bushels of corn. Without the auger running, he could not move the corn. If the corn did not move Monday, he would lose the sale because the buyer had a full schedule and could not reschedule until April. April was too late because Calvin needed the cash from this sale to make his operating loan payment in March. Earl listened to all of this without speaking. He had a habit of listening that way completely without filling the silence with acknowledgement or reassurance that some people found unsettling until they understood it meant he was actually hearing every word. When Calvin finished, Earl asked for the part number. Calvin read it from the casting. He had gone out to the machine shed in the dark at 6 in the morning with a trouble light to find the number because he was the kind of man who gathered the necessary information before making the call rather than after, and because he knew Earl would ask for it first. Earl was quiet for 3 seconds, not calculating, not searching. He knew immediately in the way he knew the layout of his own shop in complete darkness, not because he had memorized it deliberately, but because it was simply part of him. The number Calvin read was the number on the brown paper package sitting on the lowest shelf of the back wall in the back room. The last one. The single remaining hub from the 247 he had accumulated between 1985 and 1987. One hub, 14 years on a shelf. He said, "I've got one. Come get it this afternoon." Calvin said one was all he needed. Earl said he knew. Come after 2. He set the phone back in its cradle and stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, looking out at the frost on the gravel. The sky at the eastern edge was beginning to thin from black to the deep gray of an Iowa February dawn. He walked through the door into the shop, across the concrete floor, past the lathe and the mill and the welding table, and through the second door into the back room. He pulled the chain on the light. The single bulb came on and cast its familiar yellow light across the wooden shelving on 3 walls. He walked to the back shelf and looked at the brown paper package where it had sat for 14 years between a hydraulic cylinder body and a stack of bearing housings, unremarkable in appearance, indistinguishable at first glance from any other wrapped casting on the surrounding shelves. The masking tape label on its side was yellowed at the edges. The adhesive dried and lifting slightly at the corners, but the block handwriting was as legible as the day he had written it. Part number. Date. October 1987. Earl stood in front of it for a moment without touching it. Then he pulled the chain on the light and went back to the kitchen to finish his coffee. Cut to October 1987. 14 years earlier. Earl Maddox was 61 years old that autumn, which is not old and not young, but is rather the age at which a man who has paid attention to his life begins to see the shape of it clearly. What it has been, what it is, and what the remaining portion of it is likely to hold. He had been running Maddox Machine and Salvage on the same 6 acres off County Road B47 for 33 years since he came back from Korea, with 2 fingers missing on his left hand and a mechanical aptitude that the Army had been kind enough to sharpen into something precise and useful. His father had run a blacksmith operation on the same ground before that. His grandfather before that had shod horses and repaired wagon wheels on the same patch of Harlan County clay, going back to 1901. The shop had changed its name twice and its equipment a dozen times, but the 6 acres had never changed hands, and neither had the philosophy that governed what happened on them. You kept things. You kept them organized and protected and catalogued, and you kept them because the day would come, not might come, would come when someone needed exactly what you had, and if you had thrown it away the week before, you were not much use to anybody. This was not a philosophy Earl had written down or spoken aloud very often. It did not require articulation. It expressed itself in the way he ran the shop, in the masking tape labels, written in block handwriting on every casting and shaft and bearing, housing that came off a machine or came in the door, in the shelves, organized by part number and machine model, in the habit of wrapping metal in brown paper before it went on the shelf to slow the oxidation in the salvage yard behind the shop that occupied the back 3 acres and contained by 1987 the stripped remains of over 200 tractors and combines and planters going back to the 1920s. It expressed itself most clearly in his hands. Earl Maddox had the hands of a man who had worked with iron for 40 years. Broad and scarred and permanently darkened in the creases from metal dust that no amount of washing entirely removed. The left hand had only 3 full fingers, the index and middle lost to a piece of shrapnel in 1952 outside a place in Korea whose name Earl had never mentioned to his children and rarely thought about anymore. What he thought about when he thought about Korea at all was the cold. The particular quality of cold in that country, and how it was different from Iowa cold, and how both of them found their way into the bones in the end. He was 5'9" and broad through the shoulders, and he moved with the economy of a man who understood that motion was a resource, and waste was waste in all its forms. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt in every season, and in winter he added a lined canvas chore coat that had been olive green once, and was now the color of field mud from 100 washings and 10,000 hours of work. He had a way of standing very still when he was thinking, a stillness that was not passivity but concentration. The stillness of a man whose mind was fully occupied with something important, and people who did not know him sometimes mistook this for slowness. They were consistently wrong about that. Ruth Maddox had been married to Earl for 38 years by the autumn of 1987. And she had stopped making that particular mistake sometime in the first year. She was a practical woman in the best sense of the word, not unfeeling but clear-eyed, with a gift for distinguishing between the things that required worry and the things that simply required acceptance. She ran the household accounts and the shop billing and answered the phone when Earl was in the back and managed the relationship between her husband's particular form of silence and the outside world with a patience that was itself a form of love. She said more than once that Earl talked to iron more than he talked to people. She did not say it as a complaint. It was an observation offered with the mild affection of someone who has long since made peace with a fundamental fact about the person they married. In the spring of 1985, Earl began making phone calls that his regular customers would have found puzzling if they had known about them. He called men at foundries in Dubuque and Waterloo. He called the parts managers at agricultural equipment suppliers he had been dealing with for 20 years. He called retired men who had worked in the industry and who still tracked the business the way old ball players track a sport they can no longer play, with the combination of knowledge and grief that comes from having given something your best years. What he learned from these calls was not complicated, but it was important. The Whitmore Foundry in Dubuque, which had been casting agricultural iron since 1908, and which was one of the last foundries in the upper Midwest still producing wheel hubs and axle components for pre-1960 farm equipment, was in trouble. Not the visible kind of trouble that shows up in newspaper business sections, the quiet kind. The kind where the orders are still coming in, but the margins have been gone for 3 years, and the family that owns the operation is in the early stages of a conversation that has only one possible conclusion. Earl understood this because he had paid attention for 30 years to the economics of the industry that supplied his industry, and because he had made the calls that other men had not made, and because he had listened carefully to what the men on the other end of those calls were not quite saying directly. The Whitmore Foundry was winding down. It might be 2 years, it might be 3. But the cast iron, the hubs and axle housings for Oliver and Alice Chalmers and Minneapolis Moline tractors that were still being worked every day on farms within 50 miles of his shop would not be available through normal channels forever. And when it stopped being available, there would be no substitute because no one else was going to set up tooling and cast agricultural iron in small quantities for equipment that the industry had officially declared obsolete. He started ordering hubs, not in the quantities his current workload required, in significantly larger quantities spread across as many part numbers as he could justify. He ordered rear hubs for Oliver 88s and 77s and Super 88s. He ordered front hubs for Alice Chalmers WDs and WD 45s. He ordered the rear axle hub assemblies for Minneapolis Moline U and Z series machines that had been the workhorses of the flat corn country north of New Hampton for 2 decades. He ordered hubs he was not entirely certain he would ever sell because the alternative was not ordering them, and not ordering them meant they would not exist when someone needed them. Ruth discovered the accumulating inventory in the spring of 1986 when she was doing the quarterly accounting, and the numbers did not align the way they should have. She came to the shop on a Tuesday evening and stood at the parts counter with the ledger open and asked Earl to explain $400 in castings that did not correspond to any customer order. Earl said, "They will." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. She had been married to him for 37 years. She knew not in a general way, but in the specific way that comes from 3 decades of close observation, the difference between the times when he was guessing and the times when he knew. This was the second kind. She went back to the house. She did not ask again. He kept ordering. Through 1986 and into the early months of 1987, every time a Whitmore truck made a delivery run anywhere near Harlan County, Earl had a standing order waiting. The back room shelves, which had always been orderly, became dense with brown paper packages labeled in his block handwriting. Ruth trusted him across the full distance of her uncertainty, which was itself a significant act, and which Earl understood and did not take for granted, even though neither of them spoke of it directly. Now, let me tell you about Gordon Priestley, because you cannot understand what happened later without understanding who he was and how he thought and what he had built. Gordon Priestley was 31 years old in 1987, building something on the south edge of New Hampton that would become the largest agricultural equipment dealership in Harlan County within a decade. He had taken over Priestley Farm equipment from his father in 1983 and had transformed it with the kind of aggressive intelligence that turns a decent regional operation into a dominant one. He added a service department with 6 bays. He built a precision agriculture division at a time when most rural dealers were still treating GPS guidance as a curiosity. By 1998, Priestley Farm Equipment's dedicated GPS installation service was in the years before that technology became universal, doing very well indeed. Gordon was broad-shouldered and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who is the largest presence in his particular market. He drove a clean half-ton pickup, always clean-washed weekly regardless of weather, and wore a Priestley Farm Equipment cap that was always new enough to still hold its shape. He was not an unpleasant man. He was a practical man, which in the agricultural equipment business in the 1990s meant focusing systematically on what was selling building infrastructure around what was selling and releasing everything else with as little sentiment as possible. Gordon Priestley and Earl Maddox had been operating in the same county for years, serving overlapping but distinct customer bases, and their relationship had the particular quality of two men who are aware of each other without having ever had a conversation that mattered. Gordon sent customers to Earl when they needed something. Priestley Farm Equipment did not carry, which meant primarily when they needed parts for equipment older than 15 years. The way Gordon mentioned Earl's name to those customers was worth noticing, though Gordon himself would not have noticed it. He would say when someone asked about a part for an older machine that they could try Maddox out on B47, that Earl had a lot of old stuff out there, that Earl was good for that kind of thing. He said it the way you direct someone to a pawn shop when what they need is not something you carry helpfully accurately, but with a slight and entirely unconscious implication that needing a pawn shop is a step below needing a real store. Earl knew how Gordon talked about him. In a county of 12,000 people, certain kinds of information travel without effort. Earl had never said anything about it because it was not the kind of thing he spent energy on. In the fall of 1991, Gordon had his parts inventory analyzed by a consultant from Des Moines who specialized in retail inventory optimization. The analysis was thorough, and its conclusions were clear. 20% of the shelf space in Priestley Farm Equipment's parts department was occupied by components that accounted for less than 3% of parts revenue. These were primarily parts for equipment older than 15 years. They turned slowly, tied up capital, and the farmers who needed them were not generally the farmers who bought new equipment, and new equipment was where the meaningful margins lived. Gordon cleared the old inventory in a liquidation sale that October. He priced everything at his original cost, $3 a piece for hub castings that had cost him $3 in the early years of the dealership, to move it off the books cleanly and reinvest the shelf space and components for current equipment. On a Thursday morning in October, Earl Maddox drove to the liquidation sale and walked the tables set up in Priestley's parking lot. He bought, without drawing attention to himself, 17 hub castings across 4 different part numbers. He paid $51 the total, drove them back to County Road B47 in the bed of his pickup, wrapped them in brown paper, labeled them in his block handwriting, and added them to the shelves in the back room. Gordon Priestley did not know this. The thought that the old man from B47 was buying castings at his liquidation sale did not occur to him, because it did not occur to him that the old man from B47 was doing anything that required his attention. This was the nature of what Earl did. It did not look like anything requiring attention. It looked like an old man keeping old iron. In November of 1987, 6 weeks after the last Whitmore delivery truck had pulled out of Earl's gravel lot, the foundry closed its doors permanently. A brief statement was issued. The equipment was sold. 41 different part numbers that had been available through normal supply channels for decades became overnight unavailable through normal supply channels. On the back room shelves at Maddox Machine and Salvage, wrapped in brown paper and labeled in block handwriting, sat 247 hubs representing 41 of those part numbers. Earl had spent over the 2 years of buying a little over $3,000 on iron that his neighbors considered surplus, obsolete, and mildly eccentric to accumulate. On the evening of the day the last Whitmore delivery arrived, Earl went into the back room after sending his part-time machinist home and standing in the quiet shop for a moment. He pulled the chain on the light and walked the length of the shelving reading the masking tape labels. 247 packages. He had checked the count 3 times over the past week because he was the kind of man who checked his counts. He pulled the chain off and went back through the shop and into the kitchen. Ruth was at the table with a cup of coffee. She looked up when he came in. "It's done," he said. "The foundry closed." She nodded. She had known it was coming. She had watched him prepare for it for 2 years without asking more than she asked that one Tuesday evening, and she had seen enough of how he operated to trust the preparation even when she could not fully understand its logic. "How many did you end up with?" she asked. 247, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare oak trees at the edge of the property with a sound like someone slowly exhaling. "When do you think you'll sell them all?" she asked. Earl sat down at the table across from her. He was not a man who spoke imprecisely, and he took a moment before he answered. "When people need them," he said. Ruth wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The November wind moved through the oaks again. "And if nobody needs them," she said. Earl looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at his wife. "Then I'm wrong," he said. "But I'm not wrong." Ruth looked at him for another moment, the look of a woman who has staked a portion of her life on the reliability of a particular man's judgment and knows it. Then she picked up her coffee cup and took a sip and looked out the window at the dark. What Earl Maddox understood in the autumn of 1987, that the inventory analysts and the dealership managers and the precision agriculture consultants had not understood or had understood and decided not to act on, was this: the old equipment on the farms of Harlan County was not going away. It was going to keep running for another generation because the families running it could not afford to replace it, and because a paid-off Oliver 88 with sound iron was still more valuable than a new machine with a payment due every month. And when those machines needed parts, and they would need parts, there was going to be exactly one place in Harlan County where those parts existed. He was not going to be wrong about that. On the shelves in the back room, 247 pieces of cast iron, each wrapped in brown paper and labeled in block handwriting, sat in the dark of a Harlan County November and waited for the mornings that were coming toward them through the years. Time moves differently in farm country than it does anywhere else. In the city, time is divided into hours and appointments and the rhythm of things that happen on schedule. On a working farm in eastern Iowa, time divides into seasons and seasons into weather, and weather into the particular demands of soil and equipment and the biological certainty of things that must be planted and harvested within windows that do not negotiate. A farmer in Harlan County does not experience the years between 1987 and 2001 as an abstraction. He experiences them as 14 planting seasons and 14 harvests and 14 winters each, with its own character, its own demands, its own particular ways of breaking things that needed to keep running. And when things broke, certain men drove out to County Road B47. Earl sold his first hub from the Whitmore inventory in the spring of 1989. The customer was Virgil Gustafson, who farmed 320 acres of bottomland south of New Hampton and had been coming to Earl since 1971. Virgil was careful with his equipment, not meticulous because no working farmer has time for meticulous, but careful in the way that men who cannot afford repairs develop a sixth sense for the sounds and vibrations that precede them. He had gotten his Oliver 88 stuck in a frozen ditch on a February morning while moving hay to the far pasture. The extraction had involved a neighbor's tractor and a logging chain and the kind of lateral force that cast iron was not designed to absorb repeatedly. The hub cracked cleanly across the mounting face, a structural failure that was immediate and unmistakable, and that left Virgil in the frozen ditch with a tractor that could not be driven and a planting season 8 weeks away. He called Earl from his neighbor's farmhouse. Earl asked for the part number. Virgil did not have it. He had to drive back to his farm, find the stamped number on the hub drive back to the neighbor's phone, and call again. Earl had the hub. Virgil drove to County Road B47 that afternoon, paid $40, and drove home with a brown paper package on the seat beside him. What Earl did not see, because Virgil had reached the county road before it happened, was Virgil sitting in his truck at the end of Earl's driveway for nearly 2 minutes before pulling out. Not crying exactly, but close. The way a man gets close to it when something he feared was already finished turns out to still be possible. Earl went back inside and made the entry in his ledger, peeled the masking tape label from the brown paper, and set it on the corner of the counter where he set all the labels when castings left the shelf. 1 hub sold, 246 remaining. In the autumn of 1994, a man named Clement Hassel drove down from the ridge north of Ionia in a truck that had seen better decades and parked in Earl's lot and came inside. Clement was 81 years old, one of the oldest working farmers in Harlan County. He had been farming the same ground his father had broken in 1938 and intended to keep farming it until his body made that impossible, and possibly for a year or two after that. He needed a rear hub for a Minneapolis Moline U-Series. Earl went to the back room. He came back with a casting wrapped in brown paper and set it on the counter. Clement looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Earl. He reached across the counter and took Earl's right hand in both of his, a grip that was still at 81, considerably stronger than it appeared, and held it for perhaps 5 seconds without saying anything. Then he let go, paid his $40, picked up the hub, and walked back out to his truck. Earl stood at the counter for a moment after Clement left. Then he went back to the lathe, where he had a shaft to turn for a customer in Ionia, and he turned it. This is the texture of those 14 years. Not dramatic, not visible from the outside as anything other than a small-town machine shop doing what small-town machine shops do, a man behind a counter, a pot wrapped in paper, $40. The customer drives away. The ledger gets an entry. The shelf gets a little emptier. But underneath that texture, something was accumulating that had no ledger entry and took no shelf space. Every time Earl reached into the back room and came out with exactly what someone needed at exactly the moment they needed it, the understanding of what he had built deepened in the people who experienced it. Not loudly, not in ways that translated into public recognition, but in the way that trust accumulates in small communities quietly through repeated demonstration, person by person, season by season. By the spring of 2,241 of the original 247 hubs had left the back room. Earl had 6 castings remaining across 7 part numbers. He had tried to restock. He had called foundries in Illinois and Wisconsin and Ohio, sent drawings, and sample castings received polite responses and then silence. The quantities were too small. The tooling costs were too high. The market was too thin. Nobody was going to cast 41-pound agricultural hubs for pre-war tractors in quantities of 10 or 20. It was not a business, it was a favor. And foundries had stopped doing favors. So Earl had 6 hubs. And he knew with the quiet certainty that had governed every significant decision he had made in the previous 15 years that those 6 were probably all that existed in usable condition within 100 miles. The good ones were either on tractors or on his shelves, and the ones on his shelves were getting fewer. In the summer of 1999, a man Earl did not recognize drove into the lot on a Tuesday afternoon and came inside asking for a hub for a model Earl had never stocked, not a failure of foresight, simply a gap in coverage that no amount of preparation could entirely prevent. Earl did not have it. He told the man so, gave him 2 names of salvage yards in other counties that might have what he needed, and the man thanked him and left. That evening, after the shop was closed, Earl went into the back room and stood in front of the 6 remaining hubs on the back shelf. He stood there for a long time in the light of the single bulb. 12 years. He had been doing this for 12 years. He had been right about the foundry closing. He had been right about the demand. He had watched 241 hubs move off these shelves and onto machines that were still running because of them. He had the ledger to prove it. But 6 castings is a small number when you are standing in front of them in the light of a single bulb on a Tuesday evening after a customer just left with nothing, and the question that had never seriously troubled Earl Maddox found its way into the back room that night and sat with him under the light. What if the remaining 6 were the last of something the world had simply moved past? What if the men who needed these parts had already found them or replaced the machines or stopped farming altogether? What if the demand that had consumed 241 hubs over 12 years had simply finished? Earl stood in the back room for a long time. Then he pulled the chain and went back through the shop and into the house, and he did not sell the hubs, and he did not move them, and he did not do anything different the next morning than he had done every morning for 12 years. Not because the doubt had resolved itself. It had not. The doubt was still there, quiet and honest, the way real doubt always is. But Earl Maddox had built a working life on the discipline of trusting what he knew over what he feared, and what he knew was that cast-iron hubs for pre-war tractors were not a thing of the past on the farms where men could not afford for them to be a thing of the past. He went back to work in the morning. That is the kind of man he was. Now let me tell you about the autumn of 2000, because that is where this story changes direction. Gordon Priestley was 44 years old in the year 2000, prosperous, well-regarded, running the largest agricultural equipment dealership in the county, with the confidence of a man who has earned his position and knows it. He bought 6 Oliver 88 tractors at an estate sale in Mitchell County in September of that year. The estate was the Borgmann farm. Heinrich Borgmann, who had farmed that ground since 1946 and had died in August at 87, leaving behind children who lived in Des Moines and Minneapolis and had no interest in farming and every interest in liquidating efficiently. The 6 Oliver 88s were part of a larger equipment lot that Gordon bought for $11,000. It was not the kind of transaction Priestley Farm Equipment usually pursued. Gordon's dealership sold new equipment, but the price was favorable, and he had a specific customer in mind. A retired insurance man south of New Hampton who collected vintage iron and had been asking Gordon for 2 years to watch for clean examples of mid-century equipment. Gordon had the 6 tractors hauled to his lot and lined them up along the south fence. He told his service manager, Corvin Deming, to go through them carefully and assess what they needed before Gordon priced them for resale. Corvin Deming had been with Priestley Farm Equipment for 11 years. He was methodical in the way that good service managers are methodical not from training alone, but from a temperament that found disorder genuinely uncomfortable and found the process of correcting disorder satisfying. He checked compression and hydraulics and steering and brakes and electrical systems on all 6 machines over 2 days. He also checked the hubs. 5 of the 6 tractors had hubs in acceptable condition. The 6th, the one that had clearly been Borgmann's primary field machine, with the most hours the one that still had mud packed into the wheel wells from the last time it had run, had 2 rear hubs with full structural cracks running from the lug bolt holes across the mounting face. Not hairline cracks. Cracks that made the hub a safety hazard and the tractor unsaleable. The machine was otherwise in remarkable condition. Borgmann had maintained it the way men who grew up in the Depression maintained things, with the understanding that a machine you care for outlasts a machine you don't, and that the difference between the two is entirely within your control. The engine was tight, the hydraulics were strong, the sheet metal was straight, but the rear hubs were done, Corvin told Gordon on a Monday morning in October. Gordon told him to find replacements. Corvin worked through his entire parts network over 2 days, every supplier, every salvage yard in northeast Iowa, every dealer with older equipment connections. He found plenty of people who recognized what he was asking for. Oliver. 88, rear hubs, Whitmore Foundry castings, good iron. He found nobody who had them in usable condition. The foundry had been closed for 13 years. The aftermarket suppliers, who had briefly filled the gap in the early 1990s, had stopped stocking the parts when demand dried up. The salvage yards had cracked hubs, stripped hubs that had been pulled off machines precisely because they had failed. Nobody had sound Oliver 88 rear hubs. Nobody, until 2 of Corvin's service customers, asked if they had any ideas, mentioned the same name without being prompted by each other. Earl Maddox. Out on B-47. Corvin drove out on a Wednesday afternoon in late October. He had not been before. He pulled into the gravel lot and sat a moment looking at the salvage yard behind the shop, the rows of stripped frames and axle housings and wheel weights extending back further than he would have expected. Then he went inside. Earl was at the lathe. He finished the cut, wiped his hands, and came to the counter. Corvin introduced himself and explained the situation. Oliver. 88 rear hubs, 2 of them for a tractor his employer had purchased for resale. Earl looked at him for a moment with the still quality that people who did not know him sometimes found difficult to read. Then he said he might have something and went to the back room. He came back with 1 hub, unwrapped the brown paper, and set it on the counter. It was perfect. Sound casting, no cracks, no corrosion, threads clean. 13 years on a shelf wrapped in brown paper, and it was indistinguishable from new old stock because that is precisely what it was. Corvin asked how many Earl had. Earl said he had a few. Corvin asked if he could buy 2. Earl said he would have to think about it. Corvin drove back to New Hampton and told Gordon that the old man on B47 had the hubs but was being careful about quantity. Gordon said he would call himself. He called Earl that evening. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Earl noted the time in the margin of the notepad by the shop phone, the way he noted details that might matter later. Gordon introduced himself and laid out the situation clearly and professionally. He needed 2 Oliver 88 rear hubs. He understood Earl might have some. He would like to buy them. He was polite and direct the way a man is when he expects transactions to proceed on his terms. Then he said something that was also polite and direct, but that carried underneath its surface a particular assumption. The assumption that Earl was sitting on inventory. Nobody wanted that he would be relieved to move it at a fair price, that the rational thing for an old man with outdated stock was to take the offer and be grateful for it. He said he assumed Earl had more than he currently needed, given that the market for that kind of part was pretty thin these days, and that he would be happy to take them off his hands. Earl wrote something on the notepad. Then he said, "I've got 3 of that number." Gordon said, "Good, he only needed 2. Earl said, "I know you only need 2. I'm telling you I've got 3, so you understand that selling you 2 leaves me 1, and I need to think about whether I want to be down to 1. There was a pause, the pause of a man who expected this conversation to be simpler than it was turning out to be. Gordon said with the patience of a man accustomed to smoother transactions that he understood and that he didn't think Earl would be selling many more Oliver 88 rear hubs at this point anyway, given that the tractors were 50 years old. Earl said, "That's an interesting way to look at it." Gordon said, "What do you mean?" Earl said, "You've got 6 Oliver 88s on your lot right now. You told me one of them needs rear hubs. I'm wondering about the other 5. A longer pause. Gordon said the other 5 had been checked and were fine. Earl said, "Checked how?" Gordon said his service manager had gone through them. Earl said, "Cast iron cracks from the inside out. You can't always see it from the outside. Has Corvin put a light inside those hubs and looked at the mounting face from the back?" Gordon said he didn't know exactly how Corvin had inspected them. Earl said, "I'd find out before you sell those tractors. Because if one of them has a hub that looks fine from the outside and isn't fine from the inside, and someone puts that machine to work and gets hurt, that's going to be a problem for you that has nothing to do with what you paid for the castings." The pause that followed was the longest of the conversation. Gordon said he would have Corvin take another look. Then he asked again about the 2 hubs. Earl said he would sell 2 at $40 apiece, his standard price, and Gordon could send someone Thursday morning. Gordon said 40 seemed high for a 50-year-old part. Earl said, "It's not high for the only one available. But I'm not charging you for that. I'm charging 40 because that's what I charge." Gordon said he'd send Corvin Thursday morning. He did. Earl handed over 2 hubs wrapped in brown paper, took $80 in cash, made the entry in his ledger, and handed Corvin a flashlight. He told Corvin to tell Gordon to use it inside the hub castings on the other 5 tractors before putting them on the lot. Corvin looked at the flashlight, then at Earl. Then he said he would pass that along. That same afternoon, Gordon had Corvin do the inspection. 2 of the remaining 5 tractors had internal cracking that the initial check had missed fractures running across the mounting face from the inside, invisible from the outside, waiting for the moment when a ditch or a frozen rut or a lateral load at the wrong angle would finish what the years had started. Gordon Priestley sat in his office after Corvin brought him this information and looked at the wall. What Earl had just done in the course of a conversation about hub prices was prevent Gordon from putting 3 tractors with hidden structural failures onto the market. 3 machines that working farmers would have bought and put to use. 3 hubs waiting to fail at the worst possible moment. The liability that represented was not something Gordon wanted to calculate precisely. He already knew it was large. Corvin called Earl back. They needed 4 more hubs, 2 for the cracked machines and 2 that required machining to fit the 3rd affected tractor's slightly different axle dimension. Earl said he had one of the standard number left and 2 related number castings that would need machine work to fit. That was all he had for those applications. He said the only places that might have additional usable castings were a salvage yard in Decorah he had dealt with for 20 years. A machinist contact in Wisconsin who appeared at upper Midwest swap meets with carefully selected old iron, and a retired Whitmore foundry worker in Dubuque named Aldous Feeney, who had bought castings from the foundry's liquidation in '87 and kept them because he could not bring himself to send good iron to scrap. Earl said he would make calls if Gordon wanted him to. Gordon Priestley drove out to County Road B47 himself the next morning. It was a Friday in early November, cold enough that frost lay on the shaded side of each gravel stone. Gordon's breath made small clouds as he walked from his truck to the shop door. He stopped before going inside and looked at the salvage yard, the rows of iron stretching back across 3 acres axle housings stacked in columns, wheel weights, arranged by size-stripped frames going back to equipment his father would have recognized. He stood there longer than he intended to. Then he went inside. Earl was at the lathe. He finished what he was doing, switched the machine off, and came to the counter. Gordon explained that he needed to solve the hub problem on all the remaining tractors and that he wanted Earl's help. He said he was willing to pay for Earl's time. He said it without the undertone of the phone call, and Earl noticed the difference because Earl noticed most things. Earl said he would make calls. Over the next 10 days, he called Rupert Solvang at the salvage yard in Decorah, a man who had 30 years in the business and who had in the back of a steel building behind his main yard a collection of agricultural castings he had never fully inventoried because he had never needed to sell from it systematically. Rupert found one usable hub. Earl called the Wisconsin contact, who found one hub in a lot he had bought from an Iowa estate sale 4 years earlier and not yet fully sorted through. Earl called Aldous Feeney in Dubuque, who was 73 years old, who had worked at the Whitmore foundry for 19 years, who had purchased castings from the foundry's liquidation and kept them in his garage on wooden shelves wrapped in cloth for 13 years, because he was that kind of man. Aldous Feeney had one hub of the right number. Earl arranged to have all 3 shipped to his shop. He inspected them when they arrived. 2 were sound. The 3rd had a crack visible only under the right light at the right angle, and Earl set it aside because he would not sell what he would not use himself. He told Gordon this directly, showing him the crack, explaining why it could not go on a working machine. Gordon looked at the cracked casting for a long moment. "How did you know to look?" he said. "Same way I knew to buy them in the first place," Earl said. "Because I pay attention to what iron does over time." In the end, all 6 Borgman tractors went to buyers, in saleable condition with sound hubs. Gordon sold 4 for prices between $1,800 and $2,200 each. The retired insurance man bought the other 2 for $3,800 combined. The total return on his $11,000 investment was just over $14,000. A profit that would not have existed without the backroom shelves on County Road B47, and without the network of men, Rupert Solvang, the Wisconsin contact, Aldous Feeney, that Earl had been building and tending for 20 years. Men who answered when Earl called because Earl had always answered when they called. In the last days of November, Gordon drove back out to B47 one more time. Not for parts. He pulled in as Earl was closing the shop for the evening, and they stood in the cold dark beside Gordon's truck, the salvage yard, stretching away behind the shop in the thin November moonlight. Gordon looked at the yard for a while. 3 acres of iron organized in the dark. Axle housings and wheel weights and stripped frames and 100 things he could not identify from where he stood. "I need to ask you something directly," Gordon said. Earl waited. When you sold me 2 hubs and kept one, you knew you were keeping the last one of that number. Did you know it was going to be needed? Earl looked at the yard. I knew the last one of any number was the most important one I had, he said. I didn't know who would need it or when. I knew somebody would. Gordon nodded slowly. Then he looked at Earl. I sold hub stock at my liquidation in '91, he said. $3 apiece. Earl was quiet. Did any of what I sold end up here? There was a pause, not the pause of a man deciding whether to answer, but of a man choosing the exact right words. 17 hubs across 4 numbers, Earl said. I was at your sale that morning. Gordon stood very still. He was doing arithmetic, but not the arithmetic of dollars and part numbers. He was doing the arithmetic of what he had thrown away, and what it had become, and the arithmetic of who had been standing in his parking lot on a Thursday morning in October of 1991, quietly buying castings off his liquidation tables, and what that man had understood that he had not. I owe you an apology, Gordon said. Earl looked at him without expression. For how I talked about you. For years to customers. I sent them out here like I was sending them somewhere lesser, like what you do is what people do when they can't do the real thing. Earl was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he did so without heat, without the pleasure some men take in being owed an apology, and without the performance of generosity either. You built something real, he said. New equipment for people who could buy it. That matters. What I built also matters. The problem was never the 2 things existing next to each other. The problem was one of them deciding the other one didn't matter. I decided that, Gordon said. You did, Earl said. And then your hub cracked and you found out what it looks like from where I've been standing for 30 years. Gordon looked at the yard. The November moonlight lay across the rows of iron. Is there still a way to formalize what we talked about? He said. An arrangement, something real. Earl said he was willing to talk about it. He said he had always been willing to talk about it. He said nobody had asked before. They went inside and spent 40 minutes at the parts counter working out terms. Priestley Farm Equipment would refer customers with parts needs for equipment older than 1965 to Maddox Machine and Salvage as the first call. Earl would report honestly what he had. Standard prices, a modest referral arrangement, no exclusivity in either direction. When they finished, Gordon shook Earl's hand and drove back to New Hampton. After his taillights disappeared around the curve in the county road, Earl went back through the shop and into the back room. He pulled the chain on the light. On the lowest shelf of the back wall, one brown paper package sat in the cold. The masking tape label was yellowed at the edges. Part number. Date. October 1987. 1 hub left. He pulled the chain off and went to bed. Earl stood in the back room with the chain pulled and the light on, and looked at the brown paper package for the first time since November. He had come in here right after the phone call, walking through the kitchen and the shop. And the second door, with the deliberateness of a man who needs to confirm with his hands what he already knows with his mind. He pulled the chain. The light came on. The package was where it had always been. He did not pick it up immediately. He stood in front of it, the way you stand in front of something you have been tending for a long time, and that is finally about to fulfill the purpose for which you tended it. Not sentimentally. Earl was not a sentimental man, or at least he had never described himself as one, but with the particular quality of recognition that belongs to moments when the long arc of a decision finally reaches its conclusion. 14 years. He reached out and picked up the package. 41 pounds of cast iron cold in the February air of the back room. He carried it to the counter and set it down and looked at it for a moment. The masking tape label yellowed at the corners, the block handwriting still perfectly legible. Then he went back to the kitchen to finish his coffee and wait for Calvin Stroop to arrive. Calvin pulled into the lot at 2:15 that afternoon in his farm truck, a 3/4 ton with enough miles on it to have formed opinions about certain grades of hill. He came inside and saw the brown paper package on the counter and stopped for a moment, looking at it the way a man looks at something he was not entirely sure was going to exist until the moment it appears in front of him. Earl told him the price was $40. Calvin said he would have paid more. Earl said 40 was what it cost. Calvin paid and lifted the package from the counter with both hands, feeling the weight of it. He carried it to his truck with the care you give to something whose value you understand completely. Earl watched from the doorway of the shop until Calvin reached the county road and turned north. Then he went back inside, made the entry in his ledger, and peeled the masking tape label from the brown paper for the last time. He set it on the corner of the counter where all the other labels had gone across 14 years and stood there for a moment looking at it. 247 labels. This was the last one. He put it in the top drawer of the parts counter next to the ledger and went back to work. That evening, north of Ionia, Calvin Stroop and his son Denny worked in the machine shed under trouble lights strung on extension cords from a beam across the ceiling. The shed was unheated. The temperature inside was 5 below zero, and their breath made continuous small clouds in the cold air, and their hands went numb at intervals and had to be warmed in jacket pockets before they could continue. They did not talk much. Calvin and Denny were not men who filled working silence with conversation when the work required attention, and this work required attention because cold affects the hands in ways that demand more focus than the same work done in warmth. The silence between them was not tense or strained. It had the texture of the silence between two people who have worked beside each other long enough that presence is its own form of communication. Remove the old hub. Clean the axle taper. Fit the new hub. Torque the lug nuts to specification. Check the bearing adjustment. 3 hours in the cold under trouble lights, with everything depending on the fit and the function of a casting that had been on a wooden shelf since 1987. Near the end, when Denny was torquing the final lug nuts and Calvin was holding the trouble light at the angle that showed the work clearly, Denny said without looking up, "Where'd you find the hub?" Calvin said, "Maddox, out on B47. Denny said, "How'd he have it?" Calvin said, "He kept it." Denny set the torque wrench on the workbench and straightened up and looked at the hub in the light of the trouble lamp. Sound casting. Clean threads. A piece of iron manufactured in the mid-1980s, kept for 14 years on a wooden shelf wrapped in brown paper, now fitted to a machine built in 1952 on a farm in Harlan County, Iowa. "How long?" Denny said. "Don't know yet," Calvin said. "I'll find out." They shut off the trouble lights and walked out into the frozen dark and went to the house. Monday arrived without ceremony, gray and cold and flat. The sky the color of old concrete, the fields white and silent, the air still enough that the bare branches along the fence lines held perfectly motionless. The grain buyer arrived at 7 in the morning with 2 semi-trucks and a third truck for the lighter loads. He had his paperwork organized because he was a man who had learned that disorganization in his business cost money in the same way that mechanical failure cost money. Calvin met him in the yard. He had gone out at 6:15 to start the Oliver 88 and let it warm, and it had started on the second pull of the rope starter, which was not guaranteed at 15 below, but which happened that morning because the engine was tight and well maintained, and because some machines, like some men, rise to what is required of them. Calvin engaged the PTO. The auger turned. For 6 hours on that Monday morning in February of 2001, the Oliver 88 ran its PTO steadily and without complaint in the Harlan County cold. The hub that Earl Maddox had bought in October of 1987 bore its portion of the load in complete silence, the way well-made iron bears the load it was designed for, without drama, without announcement, simply doing what it was built to do. 12,000 bushels of corn moved from Calvin Stroop's bins to the buyer's trucks. The last truck pulled out of the yard at 1:15 in the afternoon. Calvin stood in the yard and watched the taillights disappear down the county road, and he did not move for a full minute, standing in the cold with his hands in his jacket pockets and the particular feeling of a man who has watched something important resolve itself in the right direction when the wrong direction was entirely possible. $41,000, the March loan payment with 11 days to spare. He called Earl the following Tuesday morning. Earl was at the lathe when the phone rang. He came to the counter and picked up, and Calvin told him what had happened on Monday. He told it in the straightforward way of a man reporting facts that matter, and that he wants the other person to have correctly. Earl said he was glad it worked out. Calvin said he didn't know what he would have done if Earl hadn't had that hub. Earl said he had it. Then Calvin asked, "How long did you have it?" Earl said, "Since October of 1987. The line was quiet. "87, Calvin said. Yes. Calvin was quiet for a moment that was longer than silence usually is. He was not calculating. He was absorbing. The specific weight of a 41-pound piece of cast iron sitting on a wooden shelf for 14 years, patient and ready, waiting for a phone call that came on a February morning when the temperature was 15 below and 12,000 bushels of corn needed to move by Monday. "How did you know someone would need it?" Calvin said. Earl was quiet for a moment. He took questions seriously that deserved to be taken seriously. "I didn't know who," he said. "I just knew somebody would." Calvin thanked him, simply directly with the full weight of what he was not elaborating on, held just beneath the words. Earl said he was welcome. They ended the call. Earl went back to the shaft on the lathe and finished the cut. Word moved through Harlan County the way true and useful information moves through small communities, person to person, at the co-op, in the grain elevator, and in the waiting room at Priestley Farm Equipment, carried by the organic network of people who understand intuitively which stories contain something worth knowing and carry them accordingly. The story of Calvin Stroop's hub and his $41,000 Monday traveled through the county across the weeks that followed. People who had been sending customers to Earl's shop for years with the casual implication of directing someone to a lesser option began to describe what he did differently, in the simple direct terms that communities use when they have decided something is true. He was the man who had the part when nobody else did. That description carried a different weight than the old one, and everyone who used it understood the difference. Gordon Priestley heard the story in early March, standing at the counter of the co-op in New Hampton with his morning coffee from a farmer who had heard it from Calvin's neighbor. He listened to it all the way through without saying anything and without reaching for his cup. When the farmer finished, Gordon set his coffee down on the counter and drove out to County Road B47. Earl was in the yard moving axle housings with the old Ford loader tractor when Gordon pulled in. He finished the load set, the arms down, switched off the tractor, and walked across the lot to where Gordon was standing. Gordon said he had heard about the Stroop hub. Earl said he had heard that Gordon had heard. Gordon looked at the salvage yard. The March light was thin and honest, the kind that shows things as they actually are. He looked at the rows of iron for a long moment longer than a man looks at something he doesn't find significant. Then he asked the question he had driven out here to ask. "The hubs I sold at my liquidation in '91, he said. "Did any of them end up here?" Earl considered for a moment, not deciding whether to answer, choosing the exact right words. 17 hubs across 4 numbers, he said. "I was at your sale that morning." Gordon went very still. He stood in the pale March light in the gravel lot at Maddox Machine and Salvage, and understood fully and without the softening that comes from incomplete understanding what he was being told. He had sold those hubs for $3 apiece in 1991. Some of them had moved through this back room and onto machines and had kept those machines running for farmers in Harlan County. All of them had been bought and kept by the man standing in front of him who had driven to his liquidation sale on a Thursday morning and quietly purchased what Gordon had decided had no value. The silence lasted long enough to be honest. "Was Calvin's hub one of them?" Gordon said. "No," Earl said. "I had 3 of that number before your sale, all from Whitmore direct, but 4 other numbers, yes. Some of those came from your lot." Gordon looked at the yard again. He was not doing the arithmetic of dollars. He already knew that arithmetic, and it was not comfortable. He was doing a different arithmetic. The arithmetic of what you throw away when you decide something doesn't matter, and what it becomes in the hands of someone who understands that it does. "I need to say something to you," Gordon said. Earl waited. "When I told customers to come out here, I said it the way you send someone to a place that's useful but lesser. Like what you do is what people do when they can't do the real work." He paused. "I believed that when I said it. I'm not sure which is worse, saying it or believing it." Earl was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was without heat and without the pleasure that some men take in being owed an acknowledgement. He spoke the way he said most things, directly and only what was true. "You built something real," he said. "New equipment for people who needed new equipment and could buy it. That's a genuine service. What I built is also a genuine service." The problem was never both things existing. The problem was one of them deciding the other didn't matter. "I made that decision," Gordon said. "You did," Earl said. "And then your hub cracked, and Corvin came out here. And now you know what it looks like from this side of it." Gordon nodded. He looked at the ground for a moment. Then he said, "The arrangement we talked about in November, I want to put it on paper. Make it real." Earl said the handshake was real enough for him, but he was willing to put it on paper if that's how Gordon's operation worked. Gordon said that's how his operation worked. They went inside and spent 40 minutes at the parts counter on the terms. Priestley Farm Equipment would call Maddox's machine and salvage first when a customer needed parts for equipment older than 1965. Earl would report honestly on what he had and what he could find. Standard prices, a modest referral arrangement, no exclusivity in either direction. When they were done, Gordon shook Earl's hand. It was a different handshake than the one in November, not in the grip, but in what it carried. A handshake between two men who have said true things to each other and arrived somewhere more honest than where they started. Gordon drove back to New Hampton. The arrangement took hold steadily over the years that followed, the way sensible arrangements do when they align with what is actually true about what a community needs. Priestley's service department sent Earl a regular stream of customers with old equipment needs, and Earl served them with the same quiet competence he had always brought to his direct customers, and the farmers of Harlan County began for the first time to receive the full benefit of what 30 years of careful accumulation on County Road B47 had produced, not because it had changed, but because it had finally been connected to the rest of the county's infrastructure for getting things done. It was not a transformation, it was a correction. The kind that happens when people stop working around each other and start working with each other, which is a thing that should always happen sooner than it does, and very rarely does. In the autumn of 2004, Leland Hartwell came to the shop at the age of 22 looking for work. He had grown up on a farm in Grundy County and had a mechanical aptitude that was not trained so much as native, the kind that expresses itself in the way a person's hands move around an unfamiliar machine, feeling for what is true before reaching for a tool. He had the same quality of stillness that Earl had, the stillness of a mind that is fully occupied, that processes rather than performs. He came in on a Monday morning, introduced himself, and said he wanted to learn. Earl looked at him for a moment with the still quality that strangers sometimes found unreadable. Then he said, "Come back Tuesday." Leland came back Tuesday. He came back every day after that for the next 4 years, and then for the years after those until the shop was as much his as it had ever been anyone's. Earl taught him everything he knew. Not only the technical knowledge, the lathe and the mill and the bore and the weld, the specifications and tolerances and clearances that live in the hands of men who have done this work long enough that the knowledge migrates from the mind to the fingers. He taught him the knowledge that lived underneath the technical knowledge, the discipline of organization, the patience of keeping inventory past the point where it made obvious sense to everyone around you. The habit of thinking about what a machine would need in 5 years rather than only what it needed today. The practice of building and maintaining relationships with other keepers, the Rupert Solvings and the Aldous Feeney's men who kept things in their own back rooms and their own steel buildings, who answered when Earl called, because Earl always answered when they called. And the central essential distinction on which everything else depended, the difference between the price of a thing and the value of a thing, and the ways in which those two numbers diverge over time in the case of things that can no longer be made. The machine on the lot is worth what someone will pay for it today, Earl said to Leland once early in those years, standing in the salvage yard on a cold morning in November. The knowledge of what that machine needs to keep running, that's worth whatever it costs to keep it running. Those are not the same number. Most people confuse them. Leland looked at the rows of iron around them. Most people throw away the second thing, he said. Yes, Earl said. They do. In the last years of his time at the shop, Earl undertook the project he had been putting off for longer than he could precisely account for. He went through the salvage yard, systematically row by row, and section by section in the early mornings, before the shop opened, and in the late afternoons, after the machine work was done, and created a written record of every part in every row. He cross-referenced by machine model, part number, and condition. He did this by hand in composition notebooks from the stationery shop in New Hampton in the same block handwriting he had used for 50 years on masking tape labels and ledger pages and the margins of the notepad by the shop phone. He worked on the project across 3 years in the hours that were available to him as his body began presenting more insistently the accounts it had been keeping. The hands that had worked with iron for 50 years still knew what they were doing, but they required more of his attention than they once had, and some mornings the cold settled into the missing fingers in ways that reminded him more persistently than he would have preferred of a place in Korea whose name he still did not say aloud. When he finished the inventory, he had filled 9 composition notebooks and documented over 4,000 individual parts. He brought the 9 notebooks to the counter on a Tuesday afternoon in early 2008 and stacked them there and called Leland over. He set them between them with the deliberateness of a man who understands what he is handing over. Leland looked at the stack. "The machines out there are worth what someone will pay for them," Earl said. "These are worth more than the machines. This is the knowledge of what the machines need and where to find it organized so someone else can use it. That's the real asset. Don't confuse it with the iron." Leland picked up the top notebook and opened it to the first page. He read the block handwriting, the columns of part numbers and model designations and condition notes. He turned several pages, slowly taking it in. Then he closed it carefully, the way you close something you understand the value of, and looked at Earl. "I won't," he said. He meant it. Earl could tell in the way he could tell most things about people after 30 seconds of paying attention to them. Ruth Maddox died in October of 2008. She had been married to Earl for 60 years. She had managed for 60 years the translation between her husband's particular form of knowing and a world that did not always have the patience to understand it. She had known not in a general way, but in the specific way built from 6 decades of close attention when he was guessing and when he knew. She had extended her trust across that distinction without reservation and without being wrong to do so, not once across all the years of their shared life. She died at home on the 6 acres on County Road B47 in the house where she had lived since 1948. Earl spent the months that followed in the shop every day, the way he had always spent them, because the shop was where he had always been most fully himself and because the work did not stop requiring him simply because his life had changed shape. But Leland noticed something different in his presence during those months, a quality he could not name precisely at the time, but that he understood better later. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. The quality of a man who has completed the central work of his life and is attending now to what remains with the full care it deserves. The way a field looks in late November when the last harvest is in not empty, not finished, but settled into its true shape, the shape it has always had beneath the growing seasons. Earl Maddox died in April of 2009 at the age of 83 on a morning in early spring, when the oaks at the edge of the property were showing the first faint green of new growth at the tips of their branches. And the frost was finally gone from the ground, and the county road outside the shop door was soft with the particular softness of Iowa clay in April, the softness of ground that has held the cold as long as it needed to and is now ready to hold something else. He had been in the shop the day before. The service was at the Methodist Church in New Hampton on a Thursday morning. The parking lot was full of pickup trucks. Several of the men who came had driven more than an hour because they had needed something from that shop at a moment when the need was serious, and Earl had had it, and they understood without having to discuss it that this was worth an hour's drive to acknowledge in person. Gordon Priestley came. He sat in the 3rd row with his hat in his hands and listened to what was said about Earl Maddox, and some of it he already knew, and some of it he had not known. And the parts he had not known settled into him quietly and took their place alongside the parts he had. Afterward, in the church basement, over coffee and the particular quiet of a community that has just buried someone it did not fully understand, Until near the end, Gordon found Leland Hartwell standing near the window that looked out over the parking lot full of trucks. He went to him and they stood together for a moment before Gordon spoke. He told Leland the story of the November phone call and the 6 Oliver 88s and the flashlight. He told it in order, getting the details right the way you tell a story when you want the person hearing it to understand that this is not just a story about mechanical parts. He told it from the beginning. The estate sale, the cracked hub. Corvin's calls to every supplier in northeast Iowa. The drive out to B47. The hub on the counter wrapped in brown paper. The flashlight, and then the inspection that found 2 more cracked hubs that no one had known were cracked. He told it all the way to the February morning Calvin Stroop's call at 6:47. The 14-year-old hub, the Monday grain sale, the $41,000, the March loan payment made with 11 days to spare. He told the part about driving out to B47 in March, asking Earl directly whether any of the hubs from Gordon's liquidation sale had ended up at Maddox's machine, and Earl confirming that yes, 17 hubs across 4 numbers, he had been at the sale that Thursday morning in October of '91. He told that part carefully because it was the part that had cost him the most to understand. Leland listened without interrupting. When Gordon finished, the church basement was quiet around them, the low sound of other conversations creating a kind of privacy. Leland said, "He told me about that." Gordon said, "What did he say?" Leland was quiet for a moment, the same kind of quiet Earl had been the quiet of a man giving a question the weight it deserved. "He said it was a good example of why you keep things," Leland said. Gordon looked at his coffee cup. The simplicity of it. After everything, after the 2 years of buying, after 14 years on the shelf, after the November phone call and the flashlight and the March conversation in the cold gravel lot, the thing Earl had said to the young man he had spent 4 years teaching was that it was a good example of why you keep things. He was right, Gordon said. Leland said he usually was. They stood together a little longer by the window looking out at the parking lot full of trucks. And then the crowd in the church basement shifted around them and they moved apart. And the morning went on. Maddox's Machine and Salvage still operates on County Road B47 in Harlan County, Iowa. The sign says Maddox because Leland Hartwell understood without being told that the name was part of what people were coming for. That a name built over 50 years carries something that a new name cannot replace. The same way 6 specific acres carry something that a different 6 acres cannot replace. Some things accumulate meaning in a particular place and cannot be moved without losing what made them meaningful. The 9 composition notebooks are in a fireproof cabinet behind the parts counter. Leland has added a 10th and then an 11th because the salvage yard is larger now than it was when Earl ran it, and the knowledge of what is in the yard needs to be kept the same way the parts themselves are kept organized, current, and ready. He organized the additions using the same cross-referencing system Earl used in the same block handwriting he practiced until he could produce it reliably, because consistency is itself a form of respect for what you have inherited. The arrangement with Priestley Farm equipment continued through the years and through the transition because Gordon understood what it was for, and because Leland understood what it was for, and because the farmers of Harlan County who benefited from it did not particularly care about the business history that had produced it. They cared about whether there was a place to call on the Tuesday afternoon when the hub cracked and the corn needed to move by Monday. There was. There still is. In the back corner of the salvage yard, under a corrugated steel lean-to that Leland built specifically to keep the weather off it, there sits an Oliver 88 tractor that is not for sale. It was the first tractor Earl's father bought new in the spring of 1952, and it has been on those 6 acres ever since, and it still runs. The rear hubs are original castings from the Whitmore Foundry in Dubuque, poured in the same year the tractor was built in the same foundry that would cast the hub that kept Calvin Stroop's auger turning on a Monday morning in February of 2001. The foundry has been closed for 37 years. The hubs are still sound. Every few years, someone comes to the shop and asks about the Oliver under the lean-to, a collector usually who has heard about it and wants to add it to a barn or a display. Leland tells them it is not for sale. When they ask why, he tells them it was Earl Maddox's father's tractor, that it has been on these 6 acres since before Earl came back from Korea. That it belongs here the same way the composition notebooks belong in the fireproof cabinet, and the masking tape labels belong written in block handwriting, and the parts in the salvage yard belong organized by model and number and condition, and kept wrapped and protected until someone needs them. Nobody argues with this. Because what Leland is describing, though he does not usually explain it in these terms, because Earl never explained things in more terms than necessary, is not a tractor. It is a record. Evidence. Proof that the things you take care of outlast the things you don't, and that the knowledge of what things need is more valuable than the things themselves. And that the most important part is always the one that nobody else thought to keep. Somewhere in Harlan County, on a farm north of Ionia, a man named Calvin Stroop made his operating loan payment in March of 2001 with 11 days to spare, because a man on County Road B47 had bought a 41-pound piece of cast iron in the autumn of 1987, and had put it on a wooden shelf in a back room wrapped in brown paper, and had kept it there for 14 years through 246 other transactions, and one evening of genuine doubt, and one conversation with his wife on a cold November night when she asked what he would do if nobody needed it, and he told her he was not wrong. He was not wrong. He was never wrong about that. Some things do not become obsolete. They wait. They sit in back rooms on wooden shelves, wrapped in brown paper, with the date and part number written in block handwriting on masking tape, patient in the way that only useful things can be, patient without anxiety, without impatience, simply present and ready, holding what they are across the years until the morning when someone who needs them badly enough knows where to call. And some men spend their whole lives making sure that when that morning comes, and Earl Maddox knew it always came for the men on the farms in Harlan County who could not afford for it. Not to come, the answer is already there. Not hoping it will be there, not guessing it might be there. Already there, wrapped in brown paper, labeled in block handwriting, on the lowest shelf of the back wall, waiting for the chain on the light to be pulled, and the footsteps to cross the back room floor, and the hands that have worked with iron for 50 years to reach out and pick it up and carry it to the counter where it has always been going. That is what Earl Maddox built on those 6 acres in Harlan County, Iowa, across 55 years of the same work on the same ground. Not a salvage yard, not a machine shop. Something that does not have a clean commercial name because what it was could not be bought in the ordinary sense and could not be sold except in pieces, $40 at a time. One transaction at a time to the men who arrived at the right moment because there was nowhere else to go. A library of last resorts organized and maintained by a man who understood more clearly than anyone else in the county, and perhaps more clearly than anyone needed to understand it except him, that the most valuable thing you can be is the person who has what other people need at the moment they finally understand they need it. Earl Maddox was that person. For 55 years on 6 acres off County Road B47, he was exactly that person. And the 9 composition notebooks in the fireproof cabinet behind the counter, and the Oliver 88 under the lean-to in the back corner of the yard, and the arrangement with Priestley Farm equipment that sends a customer out to B47 every few weeks with something old that needs a part that doesn't exist anywhere else, all of it is still there. All of it is still working. That is the whole of it.